America is a land of great museums, and every museum has spellbinding stories to tell.
Your eyes go to this extraordinary experience of paint.
There was an intent to bring some of these sensuous pleasures in the arts to America.
Mrs. Gardner's spirit is sort of walking through the museum.
One woman's collective vision, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, Massachusetts. Next on Great Museums. Major funding for great museums is provided by the Eureka Foundation, dedicated to the educational power of television and new media. Exercise your curiosity. Explore America's great museums.
100 years ago, they called it Gardner's Wall and could only guess what treasures it might hide.
All of a sudden, you're just plunged into a total assault on your senses. So you smell flowers, you hear water dropping into a fountain. You might hear a musician practicing because music is a large part of the museum. And your eyes are just invited to feast on unbelievable works of art. And I don't think there's another museum anywhere in the world that deals with all the arts and all the senses.
The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston is the creation of one extraordinary woman.
Isabella Stewart Gardner managed to acquire some of the most important works available on the market, so it's a collection of masterpieces.
Masterpieces of the old world and masterpieces of the new. The breadth of the collection is astonishing. Over 3,500 objects. There's a 1481 edition of Dante's Divine Comedy, a window from Soissons Cathedral, works by the great masters of the Italian Renaissance, Michelangelo, Botticelli, Raphael, and artists of Gardner's day, Matisse, Manet, and her own American friends, Whistler, Sargent, and Thomas Dewey, all personally arranged by her.
The museum isn't like other museums with artworks hanging on white walls. It's definitely an experience.
The museum is an extraordinary work of art, and she's definitely installed it in a very particular, personal way.
When you enter its galleries, you have immediate and almost a tactile relationship with the collection. There are very few cases, very few things are under glass.
And what I find unique about it is this combination of great works of art in a highly personal, very atmospheric setting. It's really like no other museum in America.
I meet people all over the world that say the Gardner Museum is their favorite museum, and I think it's because it is a work of art and they are immediately opened up to be different, to learn, to experience, to hear, to smell, to see, and that almost transcendent experience they never forget.
That premium on experiencing art with all the senses sprang from Isabella Stewart Gardner's own vibrant character. In 1860, she set the tongues of Boston society wagging when she married Jack Gardner, one of the city's most eligible bachelors. On her many travels to Europe, she was always the center of attention. It was this elusive dynamism that the Swedish artist Anders Zorn set out to capture during a trip to Venice.
And there were fireworks on the Grand Canal, and Mrs. Gardner rushed onto the balcony to look at the fireworks, and then turned back into the room.
Then Zorn said, "You look beautiful, stop right there, let me take a look at you." And he captures it in his mind, and then he paints this amazing portrait of her with the fireworks blasting in the background and a lot of energy about her.
That energy and enthusiasm, she soon focused on assembling her art collection.
Isabella Gardner was a really good collector, and she was also a very smart collector because she put together this collection, frankly, with $2 million. Compared to J.P. Morgan, who spent $60 million, you can see how strategic and how focused she was on getting things that she felt passionate about.
The heart of her collection is the courtyard, celebrating the vitality of life.
It's got this beautiful mosaic, first century Roman with the head of Medusa in the center, and it's surrounded by very important pieces.
Prominent among them is a Roman sarcophagus.
It shows revelers, and it's a kind of worship of Bacchus, part of the celebration of the god of wine. You have to remember that this is a coffin, and yet it's been decorated in the most lighthearted, not to say erotic manner. And I do think there was an intent to bring some of these sensuous pleasures in the arts to Boston and to America. And I think she really wanted to stir things up a little.
Inside, the Titian room houses the museum's most famous painting, and undoubtedly one of the 16th century's most sensuous pieces, Titian's Europa.
And your eyes go to this extraordinary experience of paint. I mean, the colors in it are just so intense, from the red drapery of Europa that's slipping off of her and floating into the water, to the blue rosy sky, to the sea color, to the white mottled color of the bull.
It shows the young princess Europa, who's been lured into riding on the back of a bull, which is in fact Jupiter in disguise, and she's whisked away across the sea.
And you feel the movement, you feel the motion, you see the ecstasy in the woman, and you see the bewilderment on the face of the bull. He looks like he's not quite sure what he's gotten into.
To Bernard Berenson, the young art scholar who had acquired the painting for her, she wrote,
I am back here tonight after a 2-day orgy. The orgy was drinking myself drunk with Europa. Every inch of paint in the picture seems full of joy.
I think from Isabella Stewart Gardner's point of view, it was her most important work of art. She gave it a grand place in her grandest room.
Isabella Stewart Gardner was a master of arrangement, in some respects an artist in her own right. Working in the days before electricity, she cleverly used natural light.
She was very aware of where the light would be at what time of day, and she clearly was using different kinds of natural light to play with and enhance the experience of looking at an object.
The installation of all of the galleries were entirely her doing. Each object is placed in relationship to other objects, constellations of paintings and tapestries and textiles create a very personal and very evocative setting.
Gardner's will would decree that her masterpiece, the museum, should remain as she arranged it for the enjoyment of the public forever.
Everything we do has to protect this building, because without it, there is no legacy.
Venice was Isabella Stewart Gardner's favorite city. So in 1899, when she commissioned a well-known architect to design a museum to house her collection, she insisted that he model it after a Venetian palace. But as construction began, Willard Sears soon discovered this would be no easy task.
Mrs. Gardner was totally in his face, basically, during the entire process of creating the museum, building the museum. She was there every single day with her lunch pail in her hand, up on scaffolding. And at one point, he had dug a foundation, and she actually asked him to move it 6 inches.
At the same time, Gardner was busily collecting architectural fragments to be integrated into the building.
And Mrs. Gardner herself instructed that the pink walls be fauxed in just the right way to create a courtyard that was at once old-looking but was totally of our time. And of course, it's also surmounted by a beautiful glass roof, a piece of modern architecture which ensures the courtyard is always in bloom, even in the dead of winter.
Meanwhile, speculation mounted in the press as to what this could all mean. The Boston Herald wrote, "Weird wall shuts Mrs. Jack Gardner's palace in from the world." On January 1st, 1903, the world got its first glimpse inside, beginning with a concert.
Isabella Stewart Gardner thought of music as part of her great priorities. She had so many passions, but certainly music was one of them. And we have a massive program here. It's 40 to 60 concerts. We're not just giving a nod or token glance towards Apollo or music. It's a commitment by this museum to music and the development of young talent.
When the opening day concert was over, the guests filed out into the courtyard.
It was filled with palm trees and delphinium and all kinds of flowers. And the fountain softly splashed, and people were just speechless because no one had ever seen anything like this. It was just like a dream.
It still is. One of Gardner's most magical creations is the dramatic Spanish cloister, designed to showcase one spectacular painting.
We have John Singer Sargent's great masterpiece showing this gypsy dancer doing a dance called El Jaleo, which means the ruckus, and it's just a dance of ecstasy, just to throw yourself into this and go with the music and the singing and the chanting, and everything in that picture vibrates.
John Singer Sargent created this painting in 1882 really as a homage to Spain, something that would capture the wild spirit, the joy, the music of southern Spain. Isabella Stewart Gardner, at her best, always reinforces the intention of the original work of art. The proscenium arch around the picture creates a kind of perpetual performance. We're always seeing a dance.
But the dance of life is bittersweet. At the opposite end of the Spanish cloister is a tiny chapel dedicated to her son, Jackie. The child in the altar painting bears a striking resemblance to him. Barely 2 years old, he had died of pneumonia in 1865.
And so you have the twin poles of life in this installation. You have the incredible celebration of life, and then you have the loss of life. How else can you read it? You know, it's personal.
After her son's death, Isabella Stewart Gardner sank into a deep depression. To revive her spirit, her husband took her abroad. She sometimes chose exotic destinations, Japan and Egypt. She painted what she saw.
These watercolors illustrate sunsets, and you can sort of feel the breeze blowing through the palm trees. And she's also writing, and she's writing about these experiences, riding on the back of a donkey, going up the Nile, and meeting people.
Deeply religious, Isabella Stewart Gardner always looked for a spiritual experience wherever she could find one. The long gallery is filled with objects from many different faiths. It culminates in the magnificent stained glass window from Soissons Cathedral, the masterpiece of a medieval French artist depicting the martyrdom of Saint Nicasius.
He didn't have oil paint as a medium available to him, and if the kind of paint that was used in a very small, almost miniature context. So in order to make a monumental statement as a painter, you would probably turn to glass.
In the 1990s, conservators discovered that the lead holding the glass was becoming brittle.
So the decision was made to remove the leads that hold the glass and replace them. They're probably on the order of about 800 pieces of glass, and the re-leading was probably about a 4-month project.
The religious art of the Italian Renaissance is well represented by Sandro Botticelli's warmly human Madonna of the Eucharist. In stark contrast is the Catalan Christ, an austere, almost modern-looking sculpture from 12th century Spain.
The artist who made this work really depicts all of the suffering and the emaciation of Christ's body, the sorrow of his face. It shows that profundity of emotion, I think, that only the Spanish Romanesque can really achieve.
The religious themes that intrigued Isabella Stewart Gardner are most evident in the Gothic room.
It's one of the key rooms in the entire museum. It was meant to evoke the Middle Ages of Europe. And I think one of the most remarkable things about the room is that despite this collection of medieval religious art, we find Mrs. Gardner herself in one corner of the room. And here is her portrait painted by John Singer Sargent in 1888. And when you look at the painting, we find that Sargent has created a kind of Madonna-like glow around her head. It has a halo effect. And commentators from the 1880s, in fact, immediately noticed this, that they said that Mrs. Gardner looks like a kind of Eastern Buddha of some sort. Now, there is also some gossip about the picture that it's too sexy, that the dress is too tight and too revealing. And I think these stories bothered Mrs. Gardner's husband, Jack Gardner.
So the Gothic room remained closed to the public until after Isabella Stewart Gardner's own death. But she would find for it another purpose. The Gothic room became the studio of John Singer Sargent, the first of many artists who found the Gardner Museum an inspiring place to work.
During Gardner's life, she had artists always working with her, living at the Gardner, working at the Gardner.
Some of the smaller, intimate rooms of the museum are filled with works of these artists. The Blue Room contains some of Sargent's less well-known landscape paintings. Yoho Falls, Tent in the Rockies. There are images, too, of her beloved Venice by Sargent and others. James McNeill Whistler, another great artist friend, painted this beach scene.
He was very, very uptight about selling his work. He never felt like work was finished. I can imagine him sort of like dragging on her cloak saying, no, you can't have it yet. He was a very strong personality, and so was she. She's able to walk away from the studio with that painting.
One of her most treasured pieces was Whistler's watercolor Lapis Lazuli.
Here is a woman, half-dressed, lying on her couch, gesturing with her fan towards the viewer, displaying her wares, as it were. And Mrs. Gardner was unafraid of these images. And what's amazing about this little painting is that she placed it next to a portrait of herself.
Many of the objects in the museum are gifts from artists Gardner supported. One of them was the musician Charles Martin Loeffler.
He composed what was called a pagan poem for her and performed it on the occasion of her birthday. And he also presented her with a viola d'amore, which is a beautiful viola, which is down in the yellow room right now. We have a cast of his hand, and we also have a portrait of Loeffler hanging in the yellow room that was painted by John Singer Sargent.
She really surrounded herself by artists, by writers, thinkers, poets. And so I could imagine her just walking through rooms and with Sargent and discussing the paintings and seeing the work, through his eyes.
They might have talked of the paintings by Raphael, the first to enter an American collection, or of the Annunciation, a work by Raphael's contemporary Piero Matteo d'Amelia.
The Mary is so deliciously young and beautiful. And you have this wonderful perspective in it that your eye can just seem to go on forever while the angel and Mary are confronting themselves. So there's just all kinds of wonderful geometry to the picture.
The early Italian room contains the perfect counterpoint to the Annunciation, Fra Angelico's Assumption of the Virgin.
On a miniature scale, it really shows every aspect of the Renaissance. It's got Fra Angelico's characteristic blues, from the very pale to the very saturated. It has all of the realistic and naturalistic detail, especially in the faces of the apostles who have gathered around the Virgin. Then it's got gold. Gold surfaces everywhere. Angels surround the Virgin as she's being lifted into heaven at the very top. Christ in these incredible blue robes just opens his arms to receive her.
Nearby is Piero della Francesca's Hercules, the only fresco by this introspective Renaissance artist in the United States.
It's not the Hercules we've been seeing, 50 years earlier, who's all brawn and combat and strength.
There's a kind of contemplation to the figure, the way he holds his club, the way his gaze really drifts away as though he's thinking about something that deserves a great deal of attention.
Gardner's masterpieces now inspire a new generation of artists in residence.
We have this wonderful artist here in residence at the moment, an extraordinary photographer from India. Her name is Dayanita Singh. She's really a portrait photographer. And there's so many portraits in this place, and I thought it would be really interesting to bring her here and allow her to explore the West through this collection.
During his residency, vibraphonist Stefon composed late at night in the tapestry room.
Can you imagine the darkness, the light, the mystery? You have all the tapestries surrounding him, and there he is composing among these incredible treasures.
Mrs. Gardner left her legacy for the education and the enjoyment of the public forever. And forever is about the single most demanding mandate for preservation that there can be, and it's our goal.
The McNeill room contains some of Isabella Stewart Gardner's most personal objects, including her desk. In 1922, John Singer Sargent returned to paint her in this room. By then, she was often confined to her bed after suffering a series of strokes.
This wonderful Mrs. Gardner in white, which is the last portrait we have of Mrs. Gardner. And she's really staring at the viewer and at death in the face, and is just it's so intimate and such an austere work, and it again denotes this friendship between the artist Sargent and the sitter, Mrs. Gardner.
On July 17, 1924, Isabella Stewart Gardner died. In her will, she stipulated that her collection remain exactly as she had left it. Any changes, and it was to be immediately dissolved. So, for 100 years now, the objects have been kept permanently on display.
I used to think that one thing that was forever was stone, but even stone crumbles and must be taken care of. So there's a tremendous effort involved in keeping the collection for future generations.
Archival photographs testify to the enormous effort conservators have made to keep the museum's rooms exactly as they were in Isabella Stewart Gardner's day. The Veronese room is named for the great ceiling artwork of Paolo Veronese, depicting the coronation of Hebe, daughter of Jupiter and Juno. More than 50 figures fill the heavens. Below, the walls are covered with rare Italian leather wall hangings.
There are slightly over 500 individual pieces of leather. Our concern about them was that they were becoming cockled or wrinkled on the wall and at the risk of falling off.
All 500 pieces had to be photographed, removed, treated, and then meticulously reinstalled. Isabella Stewart Gardner's most expensive wall coverings, her tapestries, have also been painstakingly conserved.
This particular tapestry, Amazons Preparing for Joust, is our earliest tapestry. It's probably around 1450, 1470. You can date it because of the dress of the women and their headpieces and their hairstyles. The horse's head and his armament are just in gorgeous condition. The gowns of the women. It reminds me that Gardner loved to collect images of women. And the collection abounds with images of women who are queens or rulers, with women who are sensuous like El Jaleo or Europa, and then it abounds with Madonnas.
The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum has become a legend, but in a single night, it was dealt a serious blow. On March 18, 1990, a pair of thieves disguised as policemen entered the museum and headed quickly to the Dutch room. Although Rembrandt's self-portrait as a young man still hangs in its place, his Storm on the Sea of Galilee is gone. So too is Vermeer's The Concert. In all, 13 extremely valuable works were taken. However, the empty frames boldly testify that Isabella Stewart Gardner's vision remains intact. She fiercely insisted that every object be in its place, yet she also left viewers delightfully free to appreciate the collection in whatever way they wish.
When you confront a beautiful flower or a beautiful woman or an extraordinarily beautiful work of art, all of a sudden you're moved to being receptive. And I think it's an uncanny strategy in this museum.
The delight that one finds in discovering something that had been overlooked before, or inventing an intriguing collection of your own as you drift through the galleries.
There's nothing to take the place of being in the space and watching the blood, sweat, and tears of the performer.
One of the wonders of bringing artists here is that they will always find a way of making new things possible, new thinking possible.
She set up such a great great legacy that we have to kind of continue in her footsteps. So everything that we do really does reflect what she started.
Learn more about America's great museums at greatmuseums.org. You can order this episode or another Great Museums program on home video for $19.95 plus $4.95 shipping and handling. Call 1-888-227-5865 or order online at greatmuseums.org. Museums hold the treasures and tell the tales of the people and places that make America great. Major funding for Great Museums is provided by the Eureka Foundation, dedicated to the educational power of television and new media. Exercise your curiosity. Explore America's great museums.